class for the day. Just in the any other business question, just as I was talking to you last week about, you may remember, the move to the West Coast, Shockley, who came out here, the people who left Shockley, who were in that picture, who first started Fairchild, and then Fairchild, funded by Arthur Rock, went on to become Intel, and the progression towards both startups, venture capitalism, and the valley built around the microchip. As it happened last week, there was a nice series on NPR, and I put the URL up on the website if you look at the slides, where they actually interviewed Noyce, I think, I'm not sure, but Moore and Andy Grove, the founders of Intel, and talked a little about that early history. So if you were interested in that, certainly better history than I gave you, so it might be worth a listen. It's still up on the NPR website. Okay, so today we're on to the question of storage and search. The reading, I'm not going to be over-optimistic about how many of you read it, but there was reading, you may remember. We're going to be looking at the whole question, but across history of storage and search. Anyone know what these pictures are of? Michael? Yeah, that is data centers, or what we would actually now call in our ephemeral way, the cloud. And there's a wonderful, nice, airy notion of the cloud. So it's worth remembering it's huge concrete buildings in cities and in the countryside using masses and masses and masses of power. And when you see Google is doing these wonderful philanthropic experiments with how to get power out of the sea and the wind, Google has to power these monsters. Well, we look at it. There's a nice paper, I should have got the reference, that was written by people at, I think, the Swedish Academy of Science a few years ago, which actually did an analysis of which was probably more harmful to the environment, a digital document or a paper document. Well, it's easy. Paper, you print it, look at that stuff. They actually said, hang on. When you look at all the power that goes into these things and the resources that they command, they actually, there's a little sleight of hand there, because they said, well, if the paper documents, when they're no longer used, are recycled or indeed buried in the ground but not burned, and if when we chop down trees to make paper, we plant new ones because they take an enormous amount of CO2 out of the air, then you can make a case that paper is ecologically better than these nice airy monsters that we call the cloud. Now, I say we should look at that with a certain amount of caution. Can you guess why we should look at that with a certain amount of caution, Michael? Well, there's one case, which is always a great claim for the net, we'll get better over time, and I'll come back to that elsewhere today, but that's a good point, but that's one. But who did I say wrote that? Where did that report come from? Can you remember what I said? Okay, now why should we just a little, much as I like the Swedes and embrace them all, why should we be just a little suspicious of that? Yeah, they're the great forest and paper producers. They had a lot invested in that report coming out the right way. So but I think it was an honest report, and it's certainly an interesting report. That the figures were even in the same ballpark is kind of amazing. And they really weren't that far off. As Michael says, things are getting better with power. People like Google are trying to see, can we have non-carbon power running these centers? But when we talk of the cloud, don't think entirely of these delicate little airy documents that we just pluck from nowhere in digital form. They have large physical instantiation. Okay, so a quick view of where we're going today, that eternal question, where are we? I talked a little last time about, as we move to the computer, it seems to go beyond Babbage's notion of just registering as the main act of the computer. There should be a question there, because I'm going to say, are we really getting beyond Babbage? The idea as we look at all this data around, one of the dominant ideas, the basic one is the internet as library. So one of the things I want to look at is just a little bit, very quickly, about what we think of as libraries and what the history of information course of libraries is. And in this, the question that I think we often look at in very linear form, are we going from closed systems to a more open system? The enormous power and appeal of open source software has given us ideas elsewhere that we're becoming an open society, and I want us to just think a little bit about that. But with that open idea, then there's this idea that we're liberating information. When we scan books, information is just being taken out from these dreadful kind of coffins that it's been living in and made free on the cloud. And I want to look at that question. And then, hoping I've left enough time, I want to get to several of the assignments. Just a quick word on assignments. I'm absolutely sure that when you sit down sometimes on a Sunday afternoon, sometimes, I say, tackle on Sunday afternoon, and face these things, you think, God, how really boring assignments are. But no, you're right, I'm not going to ask you to confess to this. Well, if you think assignments are boring, think for a moment of the poor soul who every week reads 60 or more of them, and cry a little tear for him, because he has 60 times your boredom. And on that, I would say that, some of you, it seemed to me, thought, well, here's an assignment. If I go and plug my name into Google, let's see what I find. And to be honest, I found those fairly boring too. But some of you were more adventurous, and got out and tried different things, and pushed around a bit. And I'll try to talk a bit about those, but those just made it interesting for both sides. So I think both Blake and I said, well, look, there's some interesting stuff there. So thank you for that. And perhaps we'll pause for a brief round of applause for Blake, who has been grading these assignments and still has more to go. Okay, so I hope to get to the assignment. So the question of where are we? We're still on this wretched map. Now, Jeff breezily said last week, well, of course, now we're almost going to be entirely, here he comes, just on cue. He said breezily, well, now we're more or less going to be up in the digital world from now on. Well, you should know with me, not for a second am I going to stay in the digital world. We're going back, plunging into the past, into history. We're going in some sense to be all over the map. Because in some ways, search and particularly storage have very long histories. Long histories, in fact, that will take us back, in some ways, over much of the course that we've looked at. So you can start in some way to think of some of this as kind of revision, reminding you of things that we've talked about so far that will be relevant as we go forward. And one of the aims of the course, in fact, as I said, is in part that I think to understand the world we live in now, it's important to have an understanding of the past. What do we know of England? You may remember I said at the beginning, who only England knows. Tim and I recite this every morning when we get up, etc. So we are looking back in past. We raised that question very early on with the help of Lil B of when was the age of information, and I asked you to come up in groups with when you thought it was. And some said, well, it goes back to the beginning of time, some to the beginning of DNA, lots of different ideas. Well, if we think of DNA, well, we've already got storage. So the questions of storage and maybe search come up as early as you wanted to put the age of information. I suggested that one of the things that we're always talking about as we go through this, and in fact, you'll see that I titled many of the classes in this grand term in terms of revolution. We always say we're coming up on, here's another revolution. So we had the print revolution. This is leaving aside, the agricultural revolution and the Toffler's waves. But in this, we look at science as a revolution. And with both of these, say, well, now, does it really look like it's quite what people are saying? We had what I call the unnoticed revolution, the enormous effects of time and of accounting. And one of the questions that I asked there was the question that's going to come through a lot of today, is the question of control. Are these technologies allowing us to control, or are they starting to take control of us? We looked at the communications revolution, and that was the telegraph and the telephone, and now yet again. So we call it revolutions every 15 minutes. The computer revolution was the next one, the internet, the information revolution. Maybe we're getting more and more revolutions of us, but we've certainly seen a lot of them in the state of this course. An interesting chap called Benninger wrote a book, some 25 years ago now, called The Control Revolution. And his argument that really what's been going on through a lot of this is all involved in information, and it's all to do with control. And what in some ways we should think about here are not the different technologies, but more the social question of organization and control. And I want to keep that in the back of your mind as we talk through today, and indeed as we go through the rest of the course. There's a sort of question then of who's in control and what. And this came up, I found for me, certainly, again, having just said how tedious you feel about your assignments, I was very interested in the answers that you gave to the time and accounting assignments. Partly because the class kind of divided. And some said, look, this has allowed us to take control of our world. And others said, well, I'm not so sure. This seems to me to be controlling me. There's a kind of very cheery version when we look at sort of Benninger's question of information in this, in that it's a grand move towards freedom. It's most famously made by Stuart Brand with his great claim, information wants to be free. In the next sentence he says information wants to be expensive as well. But it's been taken over as this idea of information and liberation coming together. That in fact has a long history. If you look at Galileo, if you look back to Alcinous, who come from the 1st century, this idea of thinking and ideas are the step to freedom. And what's stuck in a university are likely to think the same ideas too. It's always academics tend to support these ideas because it keeps us free. And from there come, again, these grand ideas. Paul Graham, who I think produced what I think was the inversion of Gresham's law, made the argument, look, if you just let this stuff out, the good will rise to the surface and the bad will fall away. That this internal sort of freedom and openness is inherently a good thing. And we've seen that all over the place. As I said, open source has given us this idea that in fact just letting everybody contribute is enormously powerful, and it led to a number of books. Eric Raymond's famous Cathedral and the Bazaar, saying we used to live in cathedral-like societies, but now it's much more like the Bazaar and everybody can contribute. The Wisdom of Crowd, Bank of the Wealth of Nations, and Clay Shirky with Here Comes Everybody. Now we have this wonderful sort of spontaneous and emergent society rather than the cathedral-like thing that was around before. There is kind of another case to make, though, I think, as we get enthusiastic about information. It's a harder and less popular case to make, and that's in a way the idea that perhaps information needs to be controlled. That somebody has to take charge in some ways. The interesting thing about open source is that most big open source projects have a dictator sitting at the top. Don't quite look like democratic societies when you go all the way up. And then there's the other side of it, that information leads to control. And that the more information that's out there, the more that people who can control the information can control people. The etymology of control, well, the problematic etymology, though, goes back to the notion of roles, and roles in which people are inscripted. And these are the great manor roles of England, which kind of control society. And the odd thing, in fact, is that if you look at English archives, all the legislative and legal records were actually kept on rolls up until the 19th century. I mean, I've read legal rolls in the National Archive, and so they're a kind of symbol, almost, of state authority. And you see, I think, and I certainly saw it in your assignments, this kind of paradox moving between the two. You see it in Morse. A bit of Morse we read about his petition to Parliament. I mean, he makes two moves. He said, look, one of the great assets of what I'm doing with the Telegraph is that there's a record made of every communication. And then he goes on to say, communications are secret to all but the persons for whom they're intended. And he makes that in two different points. But I think you can see there's a kind of tension between those two. Once you've made that record, the question of how permanent that secret is a tricky question. And who gets to read it, whether permissibly or whether illegally, leads to all sorts of problems for us. So these things don't necessarily move in a simple progression, but live in tension with each other. And the reading, which of course you all did, made some of those points. Vannevar Bush, who I mentioned before, founder of the National Science Foundation, created one of the first modern computers that looks slightly like Babbage's. But he writes this story about science is exploding, ideas are all over the place, and what we need is some method to capture it all and to link it all together. And long before people thought of kind of vanity webcams, he had this idea that every academic should go around with a camera on their forehead. So back in the 1940s, they saw something interesting, click, Blake, now I know who he is. And I put a little tag and a hypertext next to him, and I'll be able to find him. So he had this idea that it would be good for us all, just for everybody to gather everything. He trips the shutter as soon as he sees anything. But then in the other reading, Victor Meyer Schoenberger says, society is changing when we do this. Lots of things that were just usefully forgotten, and I think some of you felt this when you searched about yourselves on the web, things that you hoped had been forgotten, start to come back and kind of haunt you or get in the way or problematize things. And so he actually starts to say, maybe the default should be to delete. And his idea is that whenever you create a file, you should be actually asked to decide how long that file should survive for. And unless you change that setting at some time, that file will just automatically dissolve. Now, there are all sorts of problems with that. But it reflects, in a way, a changing view from 1945 when Bush was writing, and just more and more information just seemed to him ideal, to the time we live in now when people are starting to feel oppressed by the fact that we can save anything. And so it takes me back again in the course. You may remember that when we talked at first about revolution, we talked about this transition from when revolution becomes this idea of we're always moving forward and advancing, from an earlier idea that actually we just cycle round and go back and forth, that we break free and then we break back into some kind of constraint. And indeed, when you look, Tim Wu wrote this book about information empires in 2010, and he said his argument is, look, there's an oscillation. It's not a linear progress from closed to open. We oscillate back and forth between the two. And Peter Berg, who's written this remarkable history of knowledge, again, says, look, what we do is we build institutions because they're important and powerful. Now they become sclerotic or they become corrupt and we have to break them down. But then we live in a society that becomes increasingly chaotic, and so we have to start building them up again. So rather than a simple linear progression, we actually shift back and forth. And I think it's a helpful way to think about some of these things. So for instance, the idea that we sort of simply move beyond Babbage, as I said, the thing Babbage couldn't predict was all the communication. But on the other hand, what Babbage was talking about, this idea of registering and recording and counting, is still very deep in many of our ways. Just to sort of give some of the things, we'll talk more about this when we talk about the internet. Bush's idea, which he describes in that article, is for a notion called memex. And in that, he sort of lays out a kind of proto-hypertext system. That is, not only should the academic photograph everything, but it should be tagged with a link to say where that belongs and what that's associated with. And he says what we really need are not linear arguments, but lateral associations. And that idea, to some extent, was taken up by Ted Nelson over in Marin, who came up with the idea of hypertext, so that now you could look at a word and click on it, and whoa, go off. Now, this was before the web had really developed, but he said, look, what we want to know are those lateral links. I threw in there a picture we've seen before of an accounting book. Can anybody remember why that accounting book would be in there? Well, I described, and in fact, in the reading about the American accountant that you read, with each of these entries, there's a little cross-reference, either to elsewhere in the accounting books or to elsewhere in the books of other accountants, that says this has a lateral link to the information that you'll find over there as well. So in fact, accounting from the 14th century was built around, very significantly, ideas of a kind of hypertext-like link and not just linear study. But it's brought up by Berners-Lee, who again we'll talk about next week, so I won't go into now. In a way, you can say what he was really trying to do at CERN was kind of produce a better address book so everybody could find who they were at CERN, and that kind of becomes the World Wide Web. So an unambitious start. From that we get, and we'll go through this elsewhere, changes in the way in which we can have access to this information in different ways. As the web grows, we get the early browser and then later browsers, which you all know. And again, but within this, again, we're seeing changes in the relationship of people to the various services that give them access to the net and to the internet. Clarissa Jackson? No. In her assignment, she made this nice point as she looked at Google and whether you were inside or outside, and she said, look, this makes me think of a sort of gated community. And I kind of find that a very interesting observation about the world in which we're moving into. We began, and only people as ancient as Jeff and myself will remember these ghastly networks like Mead, Data Central, CompuServe, Prodigy, and even AOL, which you had to become a member of, and they kept your membership, and you could only get maximum contact with other members. But in the 90s, when the net went public, we blew all that aside and said, look, this is an open platform. It's an end-to-end platform. Anybody can contribute. Anyone can put up a web page. It's all, again, this great open progression. We're moving into the future. But that sort of raises questions about the famous face mash of 2003, of, in fact, as Tim Wu suggested, whether we're going back in, as Clarissa said, to the enclave, or if we look at new devices, which are extraordinarily tightly sealed and controlled, and beyond our control, and maybe in some ways control us. And just because it's in the news today, AOL, which seems such an ancient entity, has just made a stunning amount by selling its patents. And you can be absolutely sure that isn't going to make the world a more open place to have patents moving around in that amount of money. Okay, so what is this notion then we're dealing with storage, search, access, who keeps it, who looks? Well, there's an old idea that's been around as long as the internet, that it's some kind of library, and the way to think of the internet is as a library. The web is a global library that's produced by millions of people. Well, maybe it's kind of changing idea of a library. As one dyspeptic librarian said, it's like a library with the books all over the floor. And there you can kind of see the shift. And Jeff talked a lot about this when he talked about organization of knowledge in the 18th century, that we moved in many ways to control information then into these very organized systems, and we live in the legacy of that system now. But whether the web is the same kind of thing is an interesting question to ask. And in some ways we can see, if we look at the tools, and it's interesting again how we've narrowed down so that when I asked you about search engines, all but one person here used exactly the same search engine all the time. That we actually had a kind of choice in the 90s and used different things, and one was better for one kind of search than another. But there was a big change. And I think that it was a big change in many ways. You've heard me say for the semester end, nothing, it's all the same, nothing's really different, it's just like the past. But Yahoo was there, and Yahoo began to dominate. But when Google came along, it really did something different. Yahoo is in fact said to be an acronym. Does anyone know what an acronym for, what YAHOO, these sort of facetiously stands for? I mean, the Yahoo people knew it was a kind of joke. Does anybody know what it stands for? Yahoo's so passé, you don't even bother. It stood for yet another hierarchical officious oracle. Okay, but the idea was, and in fact, if you look at the Yahoo page of old, it divided, it actually employed, they used to whisper, we employ librarians. And they would store information and tag it by different areas. And they would say, this belongs in arts, and this belongs in computers, and that belongs in social science. And it was not unlike a library. And that reflects in many ways, again, what Jeff talked about, the organization of knowledge from the 18th, 17th century was all still there, still weighing down. But when Google came along, and although its claim was it was going to organize the world's information, it really said, no, you're just, none of this stuff, none of that old wild stuff. You're going to go just through this search box and have access to everything out there. And if there is any organization, it's going to be done by you and the links that you build and the paths that you follow. That there is no natural order. Order will be created as we move around. Well, if it is like a library, we perhaps need to ask the question, what we know about libraries, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. But we talked a little about it before, too, when we looked at books and codex. But there are libraries probably going back to at least 2,000 years before the Common Era to Ebla in Syria. That's in fact, and it was a kind of storage facility. Babylon, a little later, had much larger library. Nineveh, now becoming more recent. And what was stored, well, at Ebla, there were accounts and lists. By the time you get to Nineveh, you start to get great works of art like Gilgamesh. But the first thing really is much more the stuff that we talk about in accounting. And as I suggested then, that's often the stuff that people value much more highly. Literature, well, somebody will remember that. So you see Gilgamesh pressed in clay, this sort of sacred text. But we move away from clay. We get these different technological revolutions, which again we talked about when we talked about papyrus, and we talked about the beginnings of paper. And we also get a very changing idea of libraries. You remember that Socrates is there saying books are really, not much good for anything. What we want is the oral tradition. But Aristotle, his pupil, is already building a library of his own. He starts to accumulate books, and his library when he dies, the people try to trace where his books went, and it seems to be a fairly large collection. And not much later, by the time where we get parchment, which we talked about in northern Turkey, I talked about parchment versus papyrus and versus paper, you start to get big libraries. At Pergamon, with 200,000 books, and then most famous of all, in a number of different libraries at Alexandria, we were getting on for 500,000. So we're getting big collections now. And with collections comes, again, has traditionally the question of order. And at Alexandria, some of the most famous ordering systems, the alphabetical ordering begins there, subject categories begin there. You start to get people looking at saying, well, this is an approved version, this is scholarly, this is reliable, the text is something that you can trust, and we'll provide commentary beside to say where it's come from and what is relevant. So what we see in the library now, where of course I'm sure you build almost every day, bears a tradition going back a long way, and a lot of the systems that we use now were started then. One of the big problems, material problems for library, but also symbolic problems, libraries do become kind of centers of different civilizations. The Alexandria library was built by the Ptolemies in part to kind of say, we're a significant civilization, don't think it's all just to do with Greece, we really matter. But that also set them up, as we found in both ancient and modern times, as places that would be attacked and destroyed, as both a symbolic and an actual way to destroy civilizations. Alexandria Library was destroyed. It's highly contentious over the different burnings of that and how much was deliberate. What people tend to do is blame each other for it. But if you look at any old collections of libraries, they usually begin either from the remnants of a library that is burned or from the sacking and destroying and theft of some other library. So they don't always have such a decent history. Questions of durability as they burn come up, and all we talked about the technology of paper and the like. People were very suspicious about paper when it began. And for particularly ordering records, they would say, look, you can't use paper.